Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about how should we compensate our elected government officials. Every so often, somewhere in the U.S., a politician or a group of them is going to bring up raising their pay. In fact, they're doing it right now. How much government officials, especially elected officials, should be getting paid and otherwise compensated for their work can be a bit of a touchy subject. That's especially the case when you account for the wealthiest government officials, from president to Congress to state and local level politicians. It certainly doesn't help when one of these officials is making money on the side in a definitively or potentially illegal way, or even when it is legal. And then when a politician proposes a pay raise, oh boy, look out, because many voters probably aren't going to be happy to hear that. But there's a lot that must go into deciding how we should compensate our elected officials. Many of these same considerations also apply to appointed government officials, but for the most part, we're going to focus on elected officials today since they're more directly accountable to voters. So, what factors go into how much we compensate officials? What are some examples of compensation we already see for federal, state, and local officials? How should we decide how to compensate the politicians we elect? Well, that's what we're talking about today. So, let's begin. What factors do we consider when compensating our government officials? Now, keep in mind, these are not perfect correlations to how we determine salaries, benefits like healthcare, and so on for these elected officials, but these are some basic guidelines. So, specialized versus generalized expertise. Do we pay more for a specialized job that few people will have the knowledge and capability to do? For example, local offices, there are some special districts like water districts that are very narrow and specific in what they do? Or do we pay more for the generalized job, like most elected officials you see, because they are handling a bunch of different things and they have to have their hands in multiple jars? What do we consider a specialized job? A specialized job, again, that might include those special districts or specific court. So how exactly do we determine how to pay those officials based on whether they're specialized or generalized? How often is their job performed? Because not every elected position is considered full-time. In fact, there's a lot of state legislatures that are considered part-time, where they only meet for a few months or so in the year, at least in an official capacity. And do we only pay them for days where they show up to work, or do we still give them a full salary? Is it wages versus a salary? Several different things to consider there. What level of government are we talking about? So federal versus state versus local. Generally, we would expect the highest to lowest pay to be federal to state to local. However, there can be a lot of variation within each of those levels. For example, one state legislature could be paid massively more than another state's legislature. And because of this variation, some state officials might get more pay than federal officials in that same state, or even a local level politician might get more or get a higher salary than a state or a federal official in that state, depending on what the local office is. But generally speaking, you'll see more pay for federal level officials, then goes down to state level, and then it goes down to local level. And in a similar vein, the prestige of the position. So the more well-known, high-ranking offices will generally get higher pay, probably more benefits like healthcare. For example, if you're the Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court or of the U.S. Supreme Court, you'll probably get a higher salary. Maybe not necessarily a whole lot more, but you will get a higher salary than your associate justices on the bench. Big city mayors probably are going to get more pay than smaller city mayors, partly because there's a bigger taxpayer base there, so there is going to be more tax revenue and just the prestige of the city. A place like New York City or Los Angeles, Chicago, Tampa, Miami, probably a lot more than a small rural town out in Nebraska, for example. Not trying to pick on you, Nebraska. It's just an example. Congressional leaders versus the rank and file members of Congress, they'll generally get, the congressional leaders will generally get more money. So it's a bit more commensurate with what your ranking is in your respective level of office, and sometimes depending on what state and locality you're in. How many people are directly affected by that official's decisions? So we might expect officials whose decisions in government impact more citizens to be compensated more than officials whose decisions impact fewer citizens. So if you are the mayor of a city that has 1 million residents, you're probably going to get higher pay than a mayor who only has 10,000 citizens or even 100,000 citizens. And then if you consider officials for the whole nation versus just parts of the nation, or statewide officials like a governor versus the state legislature. So for a districted versus non-districted counterparts, because being a districted official like a state legislature or a city council, by default, you're going to have a smaller constituency to directly answer to than if you were the mayor for a city, or even if those counties that also have mayors, or a governor of a state, or the president of the United States. There's also the compensation forms beyond just a simple salary or wage. There's a type of compensation called a per diem, which is Latin for by the day, which refers to costs related to travel. So the actual travel, if you're going by car or by airplane, lodging and accommodations, food related to that travel, so on and so forth. You might also have privileges such as subsidized health care and what's called the franking privilege, which basically means when you're sending out official correspondence, you don't have to pay for stamps. You can use your official signature sort of in place of those stamps, so you don't have to pay for the stamps. Whether there is an ability to receive outside income, and this is where things get a little bit dicey, and how much outside income you can receive, if you can receive some outside income. So we're talking, for example, speaking engagements, book deals, stocks. Is there a difference between the income from works made before you entered office versus works during office? Can you make a book deal while you're in office versus, obviously before office, there wasn't a whole lot you can really regulate there. But when you're in office, are you still allowed to have book deals and speaking engagements? Because those can be very lucrative things. How much your compensation is tied to inflation. So as inflation goes up, does your compensation also go up? For a lot of places, that is the case. Some places, it's not. Does the salary or do other forms of compensation you get go up as the prices of goods and services rise and your purchasing power decreases? Again, depends on the office. And then there's also just these other unique differences between the states, because every state has its own realities to consider. Where is money already being spent? All these other programs that are also receiving tax revenue or taxpayer dollars to fund. How many elected officials there are in that state? If we take state legislatures, for example, there's a lot of difference in the sizes, where if you're talking about Alaska's legislature, it's a lot smaller than New York's legislature or New Hampshire's legislature. And then obviously the total tax revenue, which is in part due to population size. If you have a larger population, you're probably going to have a larger taxpayer base. So all sorts of things here, and this is not necessarily a comprehensive list. there might be some other factors to consider in compensation for officials that I haven't covered here, but this is just some of the really general basic things to consider when we're talking about compensation for government officials, especially the elected officials. Now let's take a bit of a deeper dive into each level of government. So federal versus state versus local level officials' compensation. And we'll go with federal level first. So obviously we have the president. The president's pay is covered by U.S. Code Title III, Section 102, which stipulates that the president gets a $400,000 per year salary paid monthly. And there's also an allowance of up to $50,000 to, quote unquote, to assist in defraying expenses relating to or resulting from the discharge of his official duties. A little bit vague, but that is the basic stipulation for the president. Now, as for Congress, as of June 27th, 2024, from a Congressional Research Service report, most U.S. House representatives and U.S. senators receive $174,000, and legislative leaders get more, referring back to earlier when I said more prestigious positions tend to get more a higher salary than their regular counterparts. Speaker of the House gets $223,500, and then the president pro tempore of the Senate and the majority and minority leaders of both chambers each get $193,400. And then you also have the 27th Amendment, which basically says that any law raising the compensation of members of Congress cannot take effect until after the next election. And that was the latest amendment that we added to the Constitution. And then for federal courts, since 1968, most years have seen an increase in compensation for federal judges. In some years, it's stayed the same, but it's partly going back to the factors we talked about earlier, going back a little bit to inflation. And for SCOTUS in 2025, the Chief Justice's salary is going to be $317,500, and then Associate Justices get a little bit under $304,000. And so taking all these federal officials together, some of the factors you see contributing to their compensation is they're in the highest ranks of U.S. government because they're at the federal level. Their decisions affect the widest range of people, not necessarily directly, some of it indirectly, but they represent the entire nation. They're in office for a considerable portion of the year, and their decisions have a wide-ranging impact on a lot of people. Because of these considerations, these are some of the biggest reasons why you see federal-level officials get the compensation that they do. Now, whether they should get more or less, well, we're going to get a little bit into that debate later on in this episode. But on to the state government officials now. So, talking about state executives. There's many different kinds of those, some of which aren't found in every state. Governor is obviously in every state. Attorney generals in every state. Lieutenant governors in almost every state. But then you've also got things like treasurer, insurance commissioner, agriculture commissioner, superintendent of schools, or might also be called education commissioner. All these other different offices that states may or may not have. Governor salaries in 2023 ranged from $90,000 in Colorado to $250,000 in New York. So there's quite a big disparity depending on the state. And Arizona, Colorado, and Oregon were the only states below $100,000 per year for their governors as of 2023. And some of the biggest jumps you saw from 2022's salary to 2023 included Wyoming, where there was a 33.3% increase. Massachusetts was a 20.1% increase, and South Dakota was a 14.4% increase from 2022 to 2023. So a decent variety of states that saw big jumps in salary for their governors. And then in other state executive offices as well, you see lots of variations in salary. But perhaps surprisingly, not every state makes its governor the most well-paid state executive. You might expect that because they're the most prestigious in their state government, but not that's not always the case. So we have data from the Book of the States, which is from the Council of State Governments, that gives us an in-depth look at compensation for these state executive offices. Again, this is 2023. Not necessarily going to be a huge difference for if we had the data for 2024 and 2025, but there might be a little bit of difference. But still, not every state's governor is that state's most well-compensated state executive. So states, and again, 2023 salaries where the attorney general actually earned more money than the governor include Alabama, Colorado, Maine, Montana, South Carolina, and some states where the treasurer actually earned more money were Alaska, Massachusetts, Michigan, Tennessee, Virginia. So pretty big variety, pretty decent variety of states there. Some that we would consider red, some that we would consider blue. So it's not necessarily tied to partisanship either. Now, as for state legislators, Ballotpedia lists 4 main ways that the salaries of state legislators are determined. Some states have a commission that determines the salary. Some states stipulate that any recommendation to change legislator pay must be approved by voters before going into effect. Some states tie their legislative salaries to those of other state employees, and then other states allow legislators themselves to set their own salaries. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit about the reasons some people may support or oppose each of those specific ways of determining compensation for governor or compensation for government officials in general, but for this particular part, we're just talking about state legislators. So pay is partially based on whether the legislature in that state is part-time, hybrid, or full-time, which basically denotes how much state legislators in a given state spend their time on their official legislative duties. Now, just because they work part-time doesn't mean that they don't actually work all that often in their legislative capacity. Some legislators would tell you that even though they're nominally part-time, it's still a full-time job. But according to the National Conference of State Legislatures last report in 2021, 10 states were considered full-time legislatures, 26 states were considered hybrids, and then 14 states were considered part-time. So generally speaking, the salary, the compensation strictly based on salary, typically goes from highest to lowest with full-time to hybrid to part-time, although you'll see a little bit of difference there. For example, there are a few part-time legislatures where the legislators actually earn more than some of the hybrid legislatures. But there's also a thing called a per diem, which we mentioned earlier on, which is Latin for by the day. So most states give their legislators a per diem regardless of whether they provide a salary. So that refers to costs associated with travel, like lodging, food while traveling, gas, basically anything that's related to the costs of travel. And in some states, it might either be the same way for every legislator, where each of them get the same per diem, or there might be states where legislators further from the capital get a higher per diem because they have to travel further. Alaska is one of those. So a little bit of difference even for within the state legislature, depending on where that state legislator resides in the state. And then for state courts, and this data is going to come from Ballotpedia, who in turn cited the National Center for State Courts Judicial Salary Tracker for 2024. For state Supreme Court justices, West Virginia was the lowest. That was just under $150,000, all the way to California, which was just over $291,000. So almost California state Supreme Court justices made almost double what West Virginia's state Supreme Court justices made. In some of these states, there's potential for the Chief Justice to make even more money in terms of salary. And then intermediate appellate court justices, intermediate appellate court being the rank just under state Supreme Court. And not every state has an intermediate appellate court. And this is for where data was available. But West Virginia, again, was at the bottom with $142,500. And then California was once again at the top with just under $273,000. And these salaries are not necessarily tied to court budgets. So we talk about earlier where sometimes a government official's salary is in part due to the availability of tax revenue. So there's a little bit of that here, but it's not entirely the case because salaries are not necessarily tied to the court budgets. We have 6 states with $1 billion plus budgets. California and New York by far have the highest budgets for their state court systems at $5.1 billion and $3.7 billion respectively, and their justices are at or near the top of pay for state court justices, so that's not surprising. But Oregon, Minnesota, and Colorado also have over $1 billion budgets, yet they rank roughly middle of the pack in terms of salaries for their state Supreme Court and intermediate appellate court justices. And so, taking all these state government officials together, some of the factors contributing to their compensation, statewide officials getting higher salaries than districted state officials. So, for example, state legislature didn't rarely, if ever, gets the same kind of compensation as a governor or attorney general or a treasurer. And the statewide officials are usually going to get more than most local level officials as well, although with some exceptions. However, just because there is more tax revenue available and just having a higher population state and therefore more citizens to affect with their decisions, that did not always correlate with officials' compensation. That is to say, just because you had more tax revenue available, a higher budget, having a higher population state affects it more citizens to affect with your decisions, that did not always translate to a higher compensation for those state level officials. A lot of times it does, but it's certainly not a perfect correlation in that regard. And now for the last group, local government officials. This is a pretty tricky group to analyze because it's much harder, if not impossible, to find info on various local government officials' compensation. There are a lot of them to account for. There's over 90,000 local governments of some form. So cities, special districts, counties, any sort of sub-state unit, there's a lot of those to account for. And it tends to be more difficult to find info on these governments, especially when it comes to governments that have jurisdiction over smaller populations. So small towns that might still have a mayor and city council, those can be very hard to find information on their government in general, let alone how much their government officials get compensated for their job. Because local government in general gets less media coverage and it has fewer resources to make info about them known than their state and federal government counterparts do. And as a result, I couldn't find a verifiable source that gives a fully accurate picture of the range of salaries and other forms of compensation that mayors, county commissioners, city councilors, and so on receive. I'm not going to quite say that that doesn't exist, but I find it very hard to believe it does exist just because there's so many local government officials to account for. So that being said, though, some of the more populous localities have some information available because, again, they're more prestigious. They have a lot more people they affect. They have more resources available, so you're going to typically find more information on them. So a few examples we can point to. San Francisco seems to have perhaps the highest mayoral salary. So their new mayor, Daniel Lurie, he was elected in 2024, he actually decided to make his salary $1 per year, but he otherwise would have made just a little bit under $365,000. New York City seems to be second place. I don't want to say definitively that it is second place, but it seems to be the second highest compensation for its mayor. Currently, that's Eric Adams. With a lot of the legal troubles that he's having, we'll see how long he lasts in there, although he is, at least right now, running for re-election to the mayoral office in New York City, but he right now makes $258,750. Oh, excuse me. New York City is not second place in that regard. I believe it's actually Los Angeles, because Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who was recently in Congress, she makes a little bit under $305,000 a year. So even though the info on them is limited, certain local government officials, whether it's a mayor of a big city or a county commissioner in a big county, if the city is big enough, they may actually make a higher salary than a state level or federal level government official in that same state. And you see that there with San Francisco's Mayor Daniel Lurie and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and New York City Mayor Eric Adams. They're not necessarily the only ones, but they're some of the most prominent examples where they actually get compensated more than a lot of federal and state level officials do in their same states. Now that we're done with federal, state, and local officials, let's just talk about officials in general. Should officials be able to receive outside income, especially elected officials? And this is a trickier question than one might assume. There are already some regulations on outside income depending on the office. Insider trading is a big no-no for anyone, especially for politicians. And for members of Congress, outside earned income, according to the Congressional Research Service, is limited to 15% of the annual rate of basic pay. So in 2024, that was a little bit under $32,000. One of the overarching debates, I guess you would say, about how much we can limit these officials' ability to receive outside income is you're kind of balancing the freedoms of speech, particularly of speech, versus the potential for corruption. Is there a potential First Amendment or other constitutional issue with preventing outside income? Now, obviously, there should be some hindrance on where elected officials receive outside income from, but where do we draw the line? They shouldn't be able to take money from nefarious actors, ones who have a clearly vested interest against the United States, but what exactly can we ban, and how far should we ban these things? So a few of the debates that you'll hear about, one in particular is, should they be able to hold stocks in companies while they're in office? There is the potential for insider trading that can and has happened already. But what if officials move those stocks into someone else's control while that official is in office? So if Joe Schmo has however many shares in Tesla or Google or whatever the case may be, what if he moves it to somebody else's control? Is that okay? Or is that not quite removed enough from Joe Schmo and he needs to sell his stocks before he gets into office? Some citizens and even some elected officials already have been pushing for requiring members of Congress to sell their stocks when they get elected, so before they get into office. Another debate is, should they be able to receive speaking fees while in office? Because speaking fees, especially for a prominent current or former government official, can be very lucrative. So do we make it so that they can only receive speaking fees after they leave office? Where exactly do we draw that line? Or is their ability to, if we hinder their ability to receive speaking fees while they're in office, is that an infringement on their First Amendment rights? Is there the potential for corruption there to allow them to have these speaking fees and just rack up all this money in a way that's maybe not necessarily legal, but potentially unethical, using and abusing their office. Is it even an abuse of their office? Not exactly straightforward debates about that kind of thing. And in a similar vein, should they be able to make book writing deals? Similar situation to speaking engagements. If they are able to have book writing deals, obviously you need to have some guardrails as to what resources they put towards book promotion. I believe it was Baltimore's previous mayor that she wrote a book. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she wrote a book and she used government resources to try to promote that book, which was illegal, and she had to resign. I don't know if she actually went to jail. I can't remember if she actually went to jail or was fined or what exactly happened, but she had to leave office. So would it just be easier to ban book deals when in office altogether? Or is that also an infringement on certain freedoms like freedom of speech? Or if we get to a little bit more of not just accumulating wealth while they're in office, but wealth before they got into office. If a politician is wealthy enough outside of their government job, should they have to forego their salary they'd receive from that government position? Now, you do see some politicians already decline their salary, and partially that's for political brownie points, but you do see, regardless of their intentions, some of them do decline their government salary. We just mentioned the San Francisco mayor. He went with just $1 a year salary when he could have had over $360,000. Now, whether that's out of the goodness of his own heart or not, that's for you to decide. But in general, there are politicians that do it for those political brownie points. So you do see some politicians already decline their salary, but should there be a rule that says, okay, you've earned, your regular job earns you 3 times the amount that this government position would get you in terms of salary. So do you have to forego your salary that way? And that kind of ties back into, should they have to sell all their stocks in other companies, all their shares, any sort of, are there other assets they should have to sell so that there's as little potential for corruption or abusing their station as possible? So if we compare specific legislatures, New Mexico, their state legislature has no salary. They only earn a per diem. So should New Mexico's legislators have fewer regulations on outside income compared to New York legislators, who are the most well-paid state legislators in the country? Is that considered fair? Even if we did decide, okay, if they're wealthy enough, they should have to forego their government salary. Okay, even if we all decided that was what they should do, what exactly is that threshold? It doesn't have to be that they earn $100,000 more than they would if their government salary was going to be $100,000. If they had another job that earned them $200,000, do they have to give up their government salary? Or does it have to be if their outside job is $300,000 or $400,000? Where exactly do we draw that line? It's not an obvious answer. And then lastly, when it comes to outside income, how much do these bans on outside income or potential bans on outside income, how much does this depend on what the office is? So, for example, should state Supreme Court justices have even more restrictions on outside income than a state governor or a state attorney general? State Supreme Court justices deal with the law, so there's arguably even more of an emphasis on making sure that they're not corrupt. But we also have state legislators who write laws. We have state executives who execute the laws. So should they have different rules to abide by than people who rule on the legality of things? Some might say yes, some might say no. There's not a clear answer on that. Some people can argue one way and some people can argue another. But these are just some of the questions to think about when it comes to bans on outside income, because it's very easy to say, oh yeah, they shouldn't be able to earn too much money because it's too much of an accumulation of power and they are and things like that. But you need to have more concrete guardrails, and how exactly those guardrails look is not an easy thing to come up with, even though some people may want to make it seem like it's an obvious thing. There's little nooks and crannies that you really have to consider. And speaking of nooks and crannies and nuances, I know talking about nuance is not the hot thing to do in politics, but let's just talk about the general debate on how much we should pay officials. So not talking about outside income or the ability to, we're not talking about outside income in general. Now we're just talking specifically about their compensation. Specific amounts of compensation aside. So forget about whether it's they're getting $80,000 a year or $100,000 a year or whatever. What are some general arguments you hear made for and against raising how much we pay elected officials? So some of the most common arguments you'll hear for paying government officials more is it gives officials more resources to do their job. They can hire more staff to help with the job. It's very easy to look at executive, legislative, and judicial elected officials. It's very easy to look at them and just assume that they're doing the entire job, but they have staff that help them out. And how big their staffs are, how well-versed and seasoned and experienced their staffs are, that can depend on states. So some state legislatures, their staff sizes are a lot bigger than in other states. A state governor in one state may have a lot more staff under him or her than in another state. And it's the same thing with state court justices. So the idea is that if they get paid more money, you are giving them the ability to hire more staff so they are more efficient to do in doing their job. Another argument that you might hear for paying these government officials more is that it gives them less incentive to look for outside sources of income, making corruption less enticing. So the idea is an official who is getting $25,000 a year, for example, they might be more enticed to look for shady, maybe not necessarily illegal, but legally ambiguous sources of outside income to supplement what they're making versus a government official of the same capacity in another state that's making like $100,000 a year. So they're making 4 times the amount. So the idea is that if you increase this government official's salary by X amount of dollars, they're less likely to want to find outside sources of income. And even if those aren't illegal sources of outside income, there's still a potential for corruption there. At least that's how the idea goes. And then one more common argument you hear for arguing for more pay for these government officials is that it gives regular people a chance to pursue becoming elected officials because they don't have to rely on that outside income. So it's not just rich people. There's a lot more variety in class backgrounds as to who can run for office and win office. So if you have New Mexico, for example, which doesn't have a salary, they have a per diem. The idea is that it's harder for regular people who are not as well resourced, or personally, if they don't have a whole lot of money to their name, whereas somebody who's a small business owner, for example, might have more money and they are more able to do that job because they already have outside income from the beginning. So the idea is they won't have to maybe take out loans to try to help them through cost of living, through being fed. So that's another thing to consider. And then on the flip side, some of the common arguments you hear against paying these government officials more money is that it costs taxpayers more money because more of their dollars are going to paying these officials. So you might have to raise taxpayer dollars, or you might have to take tax revenue that is already going towards one program, pull it from that, and then put it towards compensating these elected officials. And then you also sometimes hear that elected officials already have ways that they are compensated beyond simple salaries. And then not just talking about earlier with like speaking engagements and book deals, but they are compensated through not necessarily clearly monetized means. So they already have the prestige of being in office. So maybe after office, they can go out on the public speaking trail. They can make book deals. They can become a lobbyist. They can work in a nonprofit that deals with government relations, for example, or they can parlay it to a federal government job or trying to run for federal office. So it's the prestige and future opportunities that come from being a government official that may not be as well salaried now, but you'll get more opportunities in the future. So you hear so these are just some of the common arguments you hear for and against increasing compensation for these elected government officials. Again, regardless of what they're actually making right now, don't want to make this more simplified. So just whether we should pay them more in general or we should pay them less in general, or at least not increase how much we pay them now. But to end things off, types of offices aside, what are the methods we should use to determine compensation of elected officials? So I'm not talking about the actual level of compensation, whether they're getting $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year, they're getting subsidized health care, they're getting fraking privileges, they're getting per diems. Not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the specific method we use to say, okay, they're getting paid. The way we're determining how they get paid is this. And we just highlighted a few of those more specifically for the state legislatures, but now let's take it and apply it to elected government officials in general. So, should we use a special commission that determines their salary like some states do for their state legislators? So, some people, the arguments they would use to support that is that if you use a special commission, you're not leaving it in the hands of politicians who would have a vested interest in raising their pay, because who doesn't want to get paid more to do their job? And this commission is probably more in tune with the needs of officials and their staff versus, say, the voters. But then also, of course, you have people who would be against it. So some of the arguments that you would hear for people opposing a special commission determining government official salary is that there might be the potential for closed room deals and political agendas if commission members can run for office or interact with politicians. So even if they're not necessarily in office now, they might run for it later, or they can still be influenced by those who are in office. And then they might have the, what's the word I'm looking for? Protest is not the word I'm looking for, but they might protest about, well, who should choose the commission? It's easy to say that, oh, we'll have an outside commission determine the salary, but who picks that commission? Do politicians do that? Do voters do that? Do voters and politicians jointly pick people? Is there a specific office already, a specific person who's already in office, like a governor? Do they pick the people on that special commission? Things to consider, both for those who support having that special commission and for those who oppose that special commission. What about if we determined government salary by approval from voters? So some of the arguments from people who would support that. They'll say that voters will have a more direct say over where their taxpayer dollars are being devoted to. Obviously, taxpayers should have some say over where their tax dollars are going, but how much of that is feasible? And then if you have voters doing it, it's the potential for a more open air process as opposed to if you just had a special commission doing it. But some people who would oppose approval by the legislators would say, well, there's a potential for manipulation of voters, and especially with how rampant misinformation and completely false information is, you might see that become a problem for voters in determining, oh, how much should these politicians get compensated? And voters often aren't going to be as privy to the financial needs of these government officials, because typically and this could be a pro or a con, there's often a political risk in elected government officials trying to get voters to support a pay increase for them. Your taxpayer dollars are going to, again, let's just use Joe Schmo as an example. He's saying, hey, you know what? You should support this ballot measure that increases my pay in office. You think that's going to go over well with these voters? Generally speaking, probably not. Now, he might have all these reasons that he wants you to do that, and he might put forth those reasons to you, but then there might be somebody who opposes him and says, oh, no, he's full of it because of these reasons. Who's right? Obviously, a lot of that is up to your point of view, but voters generally aren't going to be as privy to whether or not Joe Schmo is actually telling the truth on there. There's a lot of BS that they got to sift through to see if, okay, we do need to up the compensation for these officials. Should we tie the salaries of these government officials to other state employees? So arguments in support of that would include that if you do so, there's more equal ground with other state employees. So these other or for federal employees, if you tied, let's just use the state level. If you tied the state legislators' salary, or state governors or states Supreme Court salaries to other state level government employees, it puts them on more equal ground. So if you increase the pay of these state legislators or governors or other state executives or state Supreme Court justices, then that means these state government employees are also going to get a boost in pay. And it inherently takes the needs of state employees more into consideration, since it also involves elected officials. What is good for the elected officials a lot of times will then be good for those state employees. Or if it was for federal government officials, if you were tying their salaries to federal employees, their vested interests would be similar as well. But some of the opposition arguments to tying salaries to those of employees, other employees in that level of government, they might say that, well, if you increase the pay for elected officials, that means more overall taxpayer dollars are being spent on that government, because then you have to raise other employees' pay as well. So if it's state employees or federal employees or local employees, that taxpayer base, you either have to raise the taxes on them, or you have to take tax revenue from other programs and put it towards raising those employees' pay as well. And then because of that, you might see possible cuts to government employee workforces if there's not enough tax revenue for all those salaries. So if there's, 100 local government employees for whatever county you want to use as an example, and the mayor and the county commission, their salary is tied to the salary of the local government employees. So you raise the county officials' salary. That means you raise the local level government employees' salary. But then what if there's not enough tax revenue to go around? Then that 100-person workforce might have to get trimmed down to 92 or something like that. So another case where some things might sound good in some respects and some things might not be as good. But one last one is, do you allow officials to set their salary themselves? So some people who would support this argument is these legislators, governors, state court justices, they're going to be more in tune with their specific financial needs for compensation and staff help. And it inherently makes it a simpler process if you just let them decide what their salary is going to be. But then on the flip side, you have the obvious issue of letting an elected official set their own pay. Of course, these elected officials are going to want to give themselves more pay. And it could also pave the way for a closed-door process to set compensation, so the public is not going to necessarily be privy to what's going on there. So do we use a combination of these above ways? Maybe we have a commission that says, okay, we're going to raise the compensation of these government officials that we elected by 5%. And then we also say, but the voters have to approve that. So the commission has already done it, and then the voters have to approve of it. Or what if you did both of those things and also tied that salary to other government employees of that same level? Is there another way that has not been listed here that you could potentially do it? All sorts of things to really consider here. So it's very easy to say that, government officials, they get plenty of money. They don't need any more. They get prestige and all that. There's there's a lot of politicians that undoubtedly are corrupt or abuse their station or whatever, but you can't just apply that to every single government official. And then even so, how do you can't just not compensate them. There has to be some level of compensation there. But what is that level of compensation? It's like many things in politics. Sometimes it can be made out to be much simpler than it actually is when it's a lot more complicated. So I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the factors to think about when it comes to determining compensation, and hopefully giving you more, or having you feel more empowered in discussing these things, how exactly we need to compensate these elected officials and what limits we place on them so that they can find other ways to compensate themselves when they're in office. Because there's not really an easy answer in that regard. In each state, each locality, federal level office even, they all have their own realities to contend with and to think about. So just hopefully that gave you a clear idea of how this all works. But that is going to be the end of today's podcast episode. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share, do what you can to get this podcast out there, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Share it with all your networks and your friends. Really appreciate all of you listening, and please make this, help increase the reach of this podcast. Links in the show notes with Facebook, LinkedIn, my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive, my free educational email course about some of the ways we unintentionally can enhance polarization when we're meaning to lessen it, why we make those mistakes and how we can rectify those mistakes, and several of other things I'm forgetting off the top of my head right now. But again, as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.